Hey guys, it's Shayra here. I think we can all agree that the most intimidating part of TSM is trying to figure out how to set up the rules to sell your stuff. To do that, you have to take some time to understand some of the TSM language for building operations. It really isn't that bad once you tackle the basics. This video will be focused on helping you build that basic foundation of creating and understanding operations. As you get more experience with TSM, the more complex stuff might start to interest you. Complex operations don't mean you make more gold, they just let you do more specific things if that is what you want. When you are ready to move on to the more complex auctioning operations, check out that video. It would be wise to stop relying on other people to provide you with operations you can copy-paste. There isn't much point in using other people's operations if you don't understand them or don't know how to tweak them. The best operation you can use is one that you make for yourself. Although you may use the same operation on a bunch of your groups, don't expect one operation to work equally well on every single group you have. There will be groups where you will want to make a specific operation tailored to that group. Since I know this video is going to be long, we have to dig in right away. TSM4 comes with a default selling operation for you to use. Why can't I use that? Just don't do it. Let me explain why. The default operation has no protective features. You can easily sell stuff for less than you bought it for and sell stuff for less than crafting costs. This is a deal breaker for anyone who plays the auction house. The only situation where it can be acceptable to use is if you farm your stuff, hate using the auction house, have no interest in setting up TSM yourself, and willing to sell your stuff as low as 25% of its value. You will likely sell your stuff fairly quickly, but you will be accepting a lot less gold for your stuff than if you were to set up TSM yourself. I think it is a good idea to change the default operation to something you deem more acceptable in case you have a default operation on some group or subgroup by mistake without your knowledge. It can happen especially if you import other people's stuff with operations. Sometimes the operation that was supposed to be attached doesn't attach with the import and the default operation is thrown on instead. I've seen this happen occasionally, so better be on the safe side and change it. Later in the video, I'll give you a safe option to replace it with if you like. We're not quite ready for that operation yet. We have to cover basics first. Before we get into the operations, please make sure you have your tooltips enabled. Go to settings, then tooltip settings, and make sure you at least have the auctioning values enabled like this. And if you plan on crafting things or flipping things on the auction house, then enable those tooltips as well. All the operations discussed in this video will be in the description for you to copy paste. So what are auctioning operations? They are simply the rules you give TSM telling the add-on the price range you are willing to sell an item for. There's a minimum price, normal price, and maximum price. That range is really important. If the cheapest auction currently on the auction house is somewhere in your range, then you will undercut that auction. So it goes without saying that your minimum price is the most important part of your price range to get right. Your minimum price has to be low enough to be in line with the lowest prices currently on the auction house, or you won't be undercutting anyone. If you are seeing lots of messages on your auction house window, below minimum price, posting at blah blah blah, then you should take a look at those items and see if you can improve or lower your minimum price. I've seen people ask what operation they could use for their minimum price to ensure they always undercut people on the auction house. The only way you can really do that is to set your minimum price to 1 copper, which is crazy. Please don't do that. So here are some basic questions to ask yourself when setting up your selling rules. For your minimum price, ask yourself, what is the absolute lowest price I am willing to sell this item for? For your normal price, ask yourself, if there is no competition and I have the opportunity to set the price, what do I want to post my item for? For your maximum price, ask yourself, what is the highest price I can see someone actually paying for this item? Undercutting an auction above that price would be pointless, as nobody would ever buy my item at such a ridiculously high price. So first, let's start with a trick question. Does this operation make sense? Of course not. The minimum price has to be the lowest price, the maximum price has to be the highest price, and the normal price would be somewhere in the middle. This operation would not work when you go to post on the auction house. Instead, the operation would look like this if you wanted it to work. So you can make operations like this if you have a very specific fixed gold price range you want to sell a particular item in. Of course, you can use any fixed price you want. So here I'll show you a more detailed example of how something like this is done. The rest of the examples later in the video won't be in as much detail, as the same rationale will be used on all of your operations. Let's say you have a group with the BFA augment rune in it, and you are dead set in selling it in a very specific range for whatever reason. You go to your group with the augment rune in it, make sure your mouse has highlighted that group, click on the tab at the top, Group Operations, if you are not already there. Then under the Auctioning section at the top, click on the Override Parent Operation box. Then click on the drop-down box, and all of your operations that you have created will appear here, and you can select your operation that you want to attach to that group. Now, we have no operations built yet, so let's make one. Hit the Create New Operation option. Now we just have to tell TSM what we want to do. So you can name the operation to something meaningful to you just by clicking on the pencil icon. You can always go back and change the name later. Let's jump to the Posting tab. We'll cover the other tabs later in the video. So the first thing you have to decide on is if you want to post those runes for 12 hours, 24 hours, or 48 hours. To make that decision, you have to consider your playstyle. If you like to frequently undercut, or the item has high posting fees, then perhaps you want to use 12 hours. If you dump your auctions on every 48 hours and ignore them, then just use 48 hours. And if you're somewhere in between, use 24 hours. You may have some operations that use 12 hours and others that use 48 hours. It's up to you. If you want to post 3 single runes at a time, then change it to this. The rest of it you can ignore for now, so let's scroll down to set your minimum, normal, and maximum price. Try not to get confused with the order of how these options are presented. It is all clearly labeled, so make sure you are paying attention. So let's say we want to sell our runes for 200 gold for minimum price, then just put 200 gold in there for minimum price. Make sure you hit enter so it sticks. Now let's say we want to use 500 gold for our maximum price, then put 500 gold in here. And let's say we want the normal price to be 350 gold, then just enter that. So what you have effectively done with this operation is told TSM to undercut anyone on the auction house with your battle-scarred augment rune when the lowest price currently on the auction house is between 200 gold and 500 gold. If for some reason there were no runes on the auction house, then it would just post at your normal price, which is 350 gold. Now we have to deal with situations where the current prices on the auction house are outside your range on both ends. So whenever those runes are really cheap on your server and less than your lowest price, 200 gold, what do you want TSM to do? Well, go to this box and choose your option. You can use any of those options except perhaps the maximum price. I wouldn't use that option here. Now you have to decide what you want to do if someone has perhaps bought out all the runes and reset them to 800 gold on the auction house. The maximum price you have is 500 gold, so that is far above your maximum price, so you tell TSM what you want to do here. The only sensible options here are to post at maximum price, which would be a more common option, and if you are a little devil and you like keeping prices nice and low, you could use post at normal price if you want it. So now all you have to do is go to the auction house, click on the augment rune group and hit run post scan, and every time you run that scan it will check the current lowest price in that moment, decide what to do based on the lowest price of that rune and what you have set in your operations. So every time you run this scan it will undercut your competition if the lowest price on the auction house is in your range, and you will post 3 runes each time. If you want to remove any of your auctions that have been undercut and repost them, then just click the cancel scan option. You can even set an operation like this if you want. They are all the same price, which is fine, but this is a very strange thing to do and only useful in very few specific situations. This is not the standard format you should be using. Using fixed gold value operations are neat to use sometimes if you have a very clear range in mind. Fixed prices are a godsend in the first few weeks of a new expansion. All of the typical TSM price sources are too volatile to reference in those periods. The only downside is you have to keep going in and adjusting those numbers to keep in line with the changes in the market, which can be a pain. So our next example will show you a better way to do this so you don't have to go back into those operations and adjust them as much. In TSM, there are various sources you can reference in your auctioning operations. Before you can start using them, you have to understand what they are. These are the most important ones to know as a beginner. Dbminbuyout is the lowest priced auction on your server as of the last pricing update, which is every 20 to 30 minutes or so. It is not a real-time number, that doesn't exist. Dbmarket is a weighted 14-day average of the auctions listed for a particular item on your server's auction house, favoring the most recent 3 days of pricing data. This is also called market value. Dbhistorical is the 60-day average of Dbmarket. Dbregionmarketavg is the average of Dbmarket across all servers in your region for a particular item. Dbregionhistorical is the 60-day average of Dbregionmarketavg. The stability of these numbers increase as we go down the list. Let's imagine you farm lots of herbs and you want to post them on the auction house. You can just toss an operation on that group like this. Since Dbmarket is the same as 100% Dbmarket, which is the same as market value, then this operation will give you a range to post your herbs that is just below market value and just above market value for your server. This is a very basic and simple operation that will work well for most people who simply farm their own materials. It will not need to be adjusted like fixed prices, in that the range will adjust on its own and always be just a little below and above market value on your server. If you wanted to be a little more aggressive, you could use this. Now this will get rid of your stuff a little cheaper, but likely you will sell your stuff quicker if that is your priority. Or you could be a little more conservative and use this. This will result in you selling your stuff less frequently, but when it does sell, you will get a little bit more gold than the other two versions. Now, once you decide on a range that you're happy with, then you have to select what stack size and post cap you want. So since we are talking about someone farming tons of herbs and wanting to post them on the auction house, then you probably want to post in stacks of 200. So this will post 10 stacks of 200 herbs. You can enable allow partial stack if you want, so if you had an incomplete stack of herbs in your bags, like 173, it would post that stack of 173. The other important thing you'll find on the Details tab, so click there and you will see a match stack size. I think it is really important to enable this feature in most situations. By enabling this feature, when you post your pretty stacks of 200, TSM will only undercut other stacks of 200, which is really smart. You can get away with asking for much more gold when you post in pretty stacks, so you wouldn't want to undercut the cheapest single. Some TSM users will try to bait farmers into posting their big pretty stacks way too cheap. If you enable this feature, you won't fall for that trick and will make yourself far more gold. Now imagine you want to duplicate that operation for another stack size. You simply just click on the copy icon next to the trash icon to duplicate. This will copy all the rules from that original operation, rename it so it's meaningful to you, and just simply adjust the stack size. Now just click on groups and go assign that new operation to the group so it will look like this. Now, this will post 10 stacks of 200 first. If you have less than 10 stacks of 200 in your bags, it will just post however many stacks of 200 you have, up to a maximum of 10 stacks. Then it will proceed to the next operation and post 10 stacks of 100 if you have that many left in your bags. If you have less than that, it will just post what you have up to a maximum of 10 stacks of 100. Operations using Dbmarket are great for farmers who are farming high turnover items, which are items that tend to sell quickly. This includes current expansion raw materials, herbs, ore, leather, cloth, dust, shards, crystals, meat, fish, and so on. This can also include some old content raw materials as well. It is really just anything that has a high sale rate. It is hard to inflate Dbmarket on these high turnover markets and sustain that manipulation. Dbmarket corrects very quickly in these situations, so you can more easily rely on that number for your high turnover markets. Now, as a farmer, perhaps you also farm rare items which are slower to turn over on the auction house, like transmog, for example. Operations for that stuff will need to be different. Dbmarket is simply not a good reference point for these items. When you start trying to sell rare, expensive stuff, then you need to incorporate more stable numbers into your auctioning operations. So anything that references region is generally considered stable. Things that are rare and expensive are hard to come by, so you have limited opportunities to make gold from them, so you want to maximize those opportunities. Someone on your server may have posted a super rare item on your auction house for 100 gold, not realizing it was actually worth closer to 100,000 gold according to region values, and it was the only time that item was posted on your server in a few weeks. Then Dbmarket would be 100 gold because one person screwed up. Then you will screw up if you follow suit and just reference Dbmarket, because the item is actually worth 100,000 gold, and if you are referencing a more stable number like region values, then you won't make those huge mistakes. The opposite is true if someone has artificially inflated Dbmarket on your server for that same item, and they have it posted for gold cap when region says it is 100,000 gold, then you will be wasting a lot of time and gold in posting fees undercutting at gold cap when it will likely never sell because it's so severely overpriced. So a basic operation for a farmer that is selling the more rare and expensive stuff would be something like this. Feel free to play around with those percentages. If you are on a very high population server, you will likely have to drop those percentages lower. Now that is pretty basic, and with transmog, perhaps you want to have different percentages to sell your transmog based on the value of the transmog item you are trying to sell. That is something that is beyond the scope of what I want to cover in this video. So if you are interested in this operation and want to try to understand it, I have it explained in detail step by step on Reddit, and I'll have a link to that in the description. That's just to give you a taste of what you can do with operations once you are ready to move on to the more complex stuff. There are many different ways to build your operations. There is no right or wrong, just play with it and see what kind of results you get and adjust as necessary. Now those previous examples were tailored for people who farm their stuff. This next section will be tailored to auction house players. So first we'll talk about flipping, which is when a player buys something at a cheaper price and resells it at a higher price. Then you can simply just reference your average buy price and incorporate the 5% auction house cut. So someone new to TSM might think this operation is a good start. This operation works fine if you are buying things slightly below market value and reposting it on the auction house, but if you have sniped something really cheap, for example, this operation works poorly. Imagine you sniped an item for 10 gold that was worth 100,000 gold, then the highest price TSM would let you post it for would be around 50 gold. So it would be better to set up a simple operation like this for flipping instead. The max function is really simple, so let's pause this discussion about setting up flipping operations to make sure you understand these basics first. Here are 4 examples to help you understand the structure. There can be as many items or price sources in that bracket as you want. So if you look at the first example, TSM will come up with a value for each part in the bracket, and whichever value is highest, TSM will use that value. The opposite occurs when you use the min function. Then TSM will just use the lowest value of all the items in the bracket. The first function will just use the first value that exists. So if A is referencing crafting and the item can't be crafted, then it will have no value and it will move on to B, which could be average buy. If you've never bought the item before, then B would have no value. Then it would move on to C, which might be Dbmarket. Then TSM would use that number as Dbmarket is almost always valid. It is only ever invalid for super rare items that haven't been seen on your server in the last 14 days. The average function will just simply average all the values in the bracket, provided they exist or are valid like explained in the previous example. Okay, so now let's get back to the original discussion about flipping operations. This is what we came up with. Let's talk about the minimum price first. 110% average buy divided by 0.95. What is that doing? Well, average buy is your average buy price for that item. You also have to take into account the 5% auction house cut, which is why it is divided by 0.95. So anytime you see anything divided by 0.95, that is just a way to account for the 5% auction house cut. So average buy divided by 0.95 is the same as 100% average buy divided by 0.95, which equals your break-even point, which means no profit. 105% of average buy divided by 0.95 is 5% profit. 110% average buy divided by 0.95 is 10% profit. So our minimum price is using our average buy price, taking into account the 5% auction house cut and ensuring at least 10% profit. It is also important if you are flipping items on the auction house to enable smart averages, so your average buy price is more relevant and recent. It will use average buy only for the items you still have in your inventory. Head to settings, then accounting, then enable smart averages. Now let's look at the normal price. What is this doing? TSM is coming up with a value for all the items in the bracket, and since the max function is on the outside, TSM will use the highest value. So TSM will come up with a number that is 150% of your average buy price with the auction house cut, and also come up with a number that is Dbmarket. And whichever is the highest value, TSM will use that for your normal price. Now let's look at the maximum price. TSM will come up with a number for 500% of your average buy price with the auction house cut, and also get a number for 500% Dbmarket. And whichever of those two values are the highest, TSM will use that number for its maximum price. 500% average buy is just 5 times your average buy price, and 500% Dbmarket is just 5 times Dbmarket. So this is a simple flipping operation that would be safe to use, that would ensure you didn't sell things for less than you bought it for. If you wanted to make that flipping operation a little more aggressive, you could use something like this. Play around with those numbers and check your tooltips to see the numbers it gives you for your posting range and adjust it until you are happy with it. If you are flipping super rare, expensive stuff, then consider changing all instances of Dbmarket to Dbregionmarketavg, or at least incorporate the more stable region values into the operation, for the same reasons as explained earlier. Now it's time to talk about setting up operations that reference crafting costs for those of you who like to craft things to sell on the auction house. I won't go into as much detail for this section, as it is exactly the same process as the previous section. So any items that you are crafting and selling on the auction house, you really must include a reference to crafting to ensure you are never selling anything for less than crafting costs while taking into account the auction house cut. So this is a simple operation you can use for your crafted items. As a minimum price, you are ensuring you are getting at least 10% profit over crafting costs while taking into account the 5% auction house cut. The normal price will just use whichever is higher of 150% crafting and Dbmarket, and the maximum price will use whichever is higher of 500% crafting and 500% Dbmarket. If you wanted to make that a little more aggressive, you could use this. If you are looking for a generic operation to start with or build from, you can use my SheMin, SheNorm, and SheMax that I have been sharing with TSM users for quite some time. It's great to use as a beginner. This is also a great option to replace your default TSM auctioning operation as explained earlier in the video. It has lots of safety features. It ensures you never sell anything for less than your average buy price. It also ensures you never sell anything for less than crafting cost. It also takes into account the auction house cut. The part where you see minimum Dbmarket and 150% Dbregionmarketavg, that piece is to prevent Dbmarket from getting inflated too high. If it is super rare and doesn't have a value for Dbmarket or Regionmarketavg, then it will move on and look at Dbregionhistorical. There will only be a few items in the game that wouldn't have Dbregionhistorical. Global sources have been removed recently from TSM, so I have updated my SheMin, SheNorm, and SheMax to reflect that. Vendor sell is just there for good measure to ensure you don't sell anything on the auction house for less than you can get from simply selling it to a vendor. The region and vendor sell references will hardly ever be used. The real meat of the operation is crafting, average buy, and Dbmarket. So this operation will work well for most people most of the time, but feel free to adjust it if you like. If you wanted to know how to make that operation a little more aggressive, this is an example of how that would look. If you are going to play around with this operation, then make sure you never drop the 105% any lower than 100%, which is no profit. You can drop this 70% down lower if you like, as low as you like, but only go as low as you need. So if you find 70% is not low enough, try 60 and go from there. For the normal price, you can pull the 200% down here if you like, but most of the time the operation will be using Dbmarket for normal price. So adjusting that 150% will get you results. You can pull this down to 100%. If that's not enough, pull it down to 90%. I can't imagine you needing it much lower than that. If you want to pull down the maximum price, you can pull down that first 500%, but adjusting the second 500% will have a greater effect most of the time. Keep in mind that your minimum price must be lowest, the maximum the highest, and the normal somewhere in the middle, or you will have problems posting. Then just hover your mouse over some items in the group of that operation to see what price range TSM will be selling those items for, and see if you like the range. Adjust the range up and down all you like, make it more narrow, aggressive, or wider, conservative. I would like to remind you to be cautious with setting up your operations for certain trade skill goods. Blizzard recently increased the deposit fees for single units to 20% of the price of that unit. So there will be some items where you might not want to post in singles at all. Keep an eye out for that. An obvious example would be Cobra scales. They can cost you 200 to 500 gold each. Just in posting fees for a single Cobra scale. That is insane. So if you look at the default auction house in WoW, under the trade skill section, those are where you will find the items guilty of that 20% fee. Perhaps you want to post those items in stacks of 2 instead. Another weird thing you need to know, which a lot of beginners miss, is that you shouldn't reference crafting costs for raw materials. Most of the time it doesn't matter at all, but raw materials generally can't be crafted, so it's just silly to reference it in the first place. But besides that, there are some strange occurrences with some raw mats that will royally mess up your operations if you reference crafting. Just look at the crafting cost for the Legion ore. They all say it takes 20 ore to make 1 ore, which makes the item look way more expensive than it is. Look at the BFA herbs. It says it takes 20 of a herb to make 1 herb, which is completely wrong. To just avoid all those issues, remove any reference to crafting in your operations that you are using for raw materials to save future headaches and confusion. So that's all I have for you in this video. If you understand these core concepts, you are good to go with setting up your own TSM operations. These basic ones in the video work just fine and will make you lots of gold. I was hesitant to provide these generic operations as I am encouraging people to build their own operations. At the same time, I understand that some people are just lost with this stuff and need something to start from. Take some time to play around with operations. Feel free to build your own operations entirely from scratch, or simply just use the ones from this video as a starting point. Either way, it is imperative you understand the operations and how to tweak them. Thanks for watching. Until next time.